Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about Chapter 4, all about gender inequality. So, a summary of the chapter is going to be helpful for us to know what it is that we can get from this chapter. Although many people use the concept sex and gender interchangeably, sociologically, there are significant differences in their meanings. Understanding the difference is important because what many people think of as sex differences are actually socially constructed gender differences based on widely held cultural assumptions about quote unquote masculinity and quote unquote femininity. Parents, teachers, peers, sports, and the media are all part of the gender socialization process through which individuals learn what is thought to be gender appropriate behavior. This process also results in gender inequality. Most women and men remain concentrated in different occupations and places of work, and 60% of all employed women in the United States today are concentrated in what we call a pink collar occupation. Women are also overrepresented in contingent work. The wage gap is the best documented consequence of gender segregated work. Regardless of race, men earn more than women of the same racial ethnic group. It's important to note that the wage gap applies not only to wage labor, but in professions as well. Women encounter sexual harassment on the job and often face, quote unquote, a double shift because of their dual responsibilities for paid and unpaid labor. Symbolic interactionist theorists examine how linguistic sexism perpetuates traditional gender role stereotypes and reinforces male dominance. According to functionalist theorists, gender inequality is inevitable because of the history of the biological division of labor. Conflict analysts assert that gender inequality results from male control and dominance over women and resources. Although feminist perspectives vary in their analysis of the issue, they all advocate social change to eradicate gender inequality. So by the end of this chapter, you should be able to understand the following things. 1, distinguish between sex and gender and describe the biological and social basis for gender roles. 2, discuss how socialization by parents, schools, and sports may contribute to gender inequality. 3, explain how both traditional media and social media influence our perceptions regarding socialization and inequality. 4, describe the division of labor between women and men in the workplace and discuss how this division may contribute to contemporary gender inequality. 5, explain how sexual harassment, the glass ceiling, and the double shift may have a negative effect on women in the workplace and at home. 6, discuss the major sociological perspectives on gender inequality and list their strengths and limitations. 7, compare global gender inequality with gender-related problems in the US. And finally, 8, apply each of the major theoretical perspectives to an examination of how gender-related inequality might be reduced or solved. So first, we need to understand that gender inequality is a social problem. And before we can even define it as a social problem, we need to know what the differences are. Well, let's first look at defining sex and gender. When we think of sex and gender, sex is the biological and chromosomal differences between males and females. And gender is the culturally and socially constructed differences between females and males that are based on meanings, beliefs, and practices that a group or society associates with quote unquote femininity or quote unquote masculinity. There are biological bases and social bases for gender roles because gender roles have both a biological and a social basis. The biological basis for gender roles is rooted in chromosomal and hormonal differences in men and women. At birth, medical personnel and family members distinguish male and female infants by their primary sex characteristics, the genitalia used in reproduction. So they look to see, is there a penis or a vulva between the child's legs? At puberty, hormonal differences produce secondary sex characteristics. These are the physical traits that, along with reproductive organs, identifies a person's sex. Female secondary sex characteristics include menstruation, more prominent breasts, wider hips, narrower shoulders, and a layer of fatty tissue throughout the body. Male secondary sex characteristics include larger genitals, a more muscular build, a deeper voice, more body and facial hair, and greater height. Boys and girls who are given similar toys and equipment and who are similarly encouraged to act in certain ways are actually quite similar in behavior. Thus, the girl who throws like a girl is probably a product of her culture and time. She has had more limited experience than many boys at throwing the ball and engaging in competitive games at an early age. The social basis for gender roles is what's called the gender belief system. These are the ideas regarding masculinity and femininity that are held to be valid in a society. The gendered belief system is reflected in the gender division of labor. Now, there's evidence from cross-cultural studies that show that social factors, more than biological factors, influence the gender division of labor in societies. Across cultures, women's domain is the private and domestic domain, and the men's domain is the public domain, or public sphere, which is economic and political. Given their domain, men have greater access to wealth, power, and prestige, a situation that leads to gender inequality in other areas. Something else that we need to think about too is that women constitute the numerical majority in the United States. However, they sometimes are referred to as the largest minority group because they typically don't possess as much wealth, power, or prestige as their male counterparts. We also need to take a look too when we think about gender inequality that this a lot of times can be related to sexism. This is the subordination of one sex, usually female, based on the assumed superiority of the other sex, and is but one of the many social problems associated with gender inequality. We also have pervasive sexism, along with racism and class-based inequalities, which is deeply rooted in society, where it has a negative effect on women and men alike. What you see here is an image of what it looks like to shop for girls, because for girls, you are associated with the color pink. When we look at gender inequality and socialization, some things to think about is that there are different groups that help us to understand what it means to be masculine or feminine. Gender socialization by parents is the first topic that we're going to look at. From birth, parents create and maintain gender distinctions between girls and boys through different treatment. Since parents typically believe boys are less fragile than girls, they are more likely to play with an infant son more vigorously. Parents tend to cuddle girls, treat them gently, and provide them with verbal stimulation through cooing, talking, and singing to them. Parents reinforce gender distinctions through their selection of children's clothing. Boys are dressed in boldly colored, quote unquote, rough and tough clothing, while girls are dressed in softly colored, quote unquote, feminine clothing. Parents further reinforce gender stereotyping and gender distinctions through the toys they buy. Parents buy blocks and building sets, vehicles, sporting equipment, and action toys such as guns, tanks, and soldiers for boys, and dolls, doll clothing, doll houses, play cosmetic, and homemaking items like dishes and miniature ovens for girls. These toys develop different types and styles of skills and can encourage children to participate in gender-typed activities. Chores also reinforce gender distinction. Boys are assigned maintenance chores such as carrying out the garbage, cleaning up the yard, or helping dad or an older brother, while girls are given domestic chores such as shopping, cooking, clearing the table, and doing laundry. Gender-specific household assignments send a powerful message about the gender division of labor. Gender socialization by parents do not end with childhood, but continue to play an instrumental role throughout adolescence and into adulthood. Oh, sorry about that. Now we look at peers and gender socialization. So in peer groups, these are social groups linked by common interests and generally similar by age. These are powerful socializing agents that can reinforce existing gender stereotypes and pressure individuals to engage in gender-appropriate behavior. Children, especially males, are more widely accepted by their peers when they conform to the group's notion of gender-appropriate behavior. During pre-adolescence, male peer groups also reinforce gender-appropriate emotions in boys. Peers are important in both women's and men's development of gender identity and their aspirations for the future. Now we look at education and gender socialization. Teachers may reinforce gender distinction through gender bias. a situation in which favoritism is shown towards one gender. So education scholars found in 1994 that teachers usually very subtly convey the message that boys are more important than girls in devoting more time, effort, and attention to boys. Teachers praise girls for their appearance and neatness, but boys are praised for their accomplishments. Some educational analysts have suggested that boys are now at a disadvantage in classrooms. Classrooms and teachers' attitudes have been remodeled to serve the needs of girls. A form of reverse sexism has developed in recent decades that places boys at a disadvantage in learning environments that are less structured and focus less on grades and competition. We also should talk for a second about sexual harassment. These are unwanted advances or other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature, and it's frequently overlooked by teachers and school administrators. For many girls and young women, this creates a hostile environment that makes it more difficult for them to learn and accomplish as much as boys. Although both genders suffer sexual harassment, girls are more likely than boys to report negative consequences of these actions. Boys are encouraged to see themselves and other males as better than girls and to distance themselves from any activity that is considered feminine. They tend to receive lower grades and are more likely to drop out of school. And unfortunately, sexual harassment is common on college campuses. Female students are more likely to be the object of sexual jokes, comments, gestures, and looks, while males are more likely to be teased about being gay. Males are more likely than women to harass others. Victims typically don't report sexual harassment. Let's look at sports and gender socialization. Girls' participation in athletics has increased dramatically since the 1972 passage of Title IX. Sports participation is an important part of gender socialization. Males' participation is about 1.5 times that of girls. Emphasis on greater gender equality in sports has contributed to a more positive outlook for girls and women in regard to participation in a wider variety of athletic endeavors. So this picture here, which I don't know why it's not showing up, and I apologize for that, but it is in your book. It's about the different, I apologize for that. It's actually listed on page 62 in your book, and it's looking at a closer picture of how there's two lines. Social scientists point out that gender socialization occurs in many ways, including how teachers or school activities, in this case, by sex, where you have the girls lined up on the left and the boys lined up on the right. That leads to the understanding that there are gender differences, that girls are on one side and boys are on the other. They will be treated accordingly. So now let's look at traditional media, social media, and gender socialization and inequality. The media, including newspapers, magazines, television, movies, and the internet, are powerful sources of gender stereotyping. From children's cartoons to adult shows, more male than female roles are shown on TV. Male characters are strikingly different from female ones. Male characters are more aggressive, constructive, and direct, while female characters defer to others or manipulate them by acting helpless or seductive. There's also this competitive and relationship-oriented reality shows that are booming. Usually the ultimate prize on many reality shows is either winning money or winning a person, who is increasingly dehumanizing and sexualized as the series progress. Many female characters are still shown as being too emotional and unable to resolve their personal problems or as sexual objects. Female characters who are supervisors or bosses are often portrayed as loud, bossy, and domineering. So what we see here is a scene from The Bachelor, and this is just about that the ultimate prize is winning a person, so the Bachelor can win one of these women. It's also something to look at in this picture here is the number of women and men in the civilian labor force between 1970 and 2015. While there still are more men in the labor force, as you look towards 2015, that gap is narrowing. And there have also been times, especially around 1996, where there were less women, there was a dip, but it has increased more than their male counterparts. We also see here the share of women and men in civilian labor forces. There are still a gap, but women are still completing more of that private sphere work and men completing more of that public sphere work. We also see here, this is employment percentages by occupation and sex. So you can see that receptionists, supports, assistants, social workers, human resources, and admin, and working in different community and social service organizations, they're still very female dominated. But then you look at management, doctors, lawyers, software developers, computer admins, architects, engineers, they're very much male dominated. That's one of the reasons why in education there's been such a push for women to enter into STEM fields. STEM fields stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. When we think about gender inequality at work, something for us to think about is that many sociologists believe that social institutions and structures assign different roles and responsibilities to women and men, and in the process, restrict women's opportunities. Now, let's talk about a couple of things with this. First, there's individual sexism. This helps to reinforce gender inequality and refers to an individual's belief and actions that are rooted in anti-female prejudice and stereotypic beliefs. We also have institutional sexism. This also serves to reinforce gender inequality and refers to the power that men have to engage in sex discrimination at the organizational and institutional levels of society. The pattern of male domination and female subordination, this is known as patriarchy, a hierarchical system of social organization in which culture, politics, and economic structures are controlled by men. But we also have to look at the gender division of paid work. This contributes to contemporary gender inequality. A higher proportion of women of all races, ages, and marital status groups are employers seeking work now more than ever before. The proportion of male employees in the United States has declined due to the closing of factories, decline of labor unions, globalization of the workforce, and the recession. The term gender segregated work refers to the extent to which men and women are concentrated in different occupations and places at work. Gender segregated work is most visible in occupations that remain more than 90% female. Again, what we just saw, secretaries, nurses, teachers, bookkeepers, social workers, human service, social service oriented field. This also can be assigned to work that's visible in occupations where more than 90% are male. These are carpenters, construction workers, mechanics, truck drivers, electrical engineers, doctors, and lawyers. Employed women in the United States today are concentrated in what are called pink collar occupations, such as clerical work and in service occupations like counter help in fast food restaurants, medical assistants, and childcare workers. Historically, women have also been overrepresented in contingent work. This is part-time work, temporary work, or subcontracted work that offers advantages to employers but can be detrimental to workers' welfare. They're not afforded the same opportunities as if they were working full-time somewhere. Occupational segregation by race and ethnicity persists. Today, a larger percentage of Asian American women and white women hold managerial, professional, and related occupations than Black, African American, or Latinas combined. In service occupations, such as private household workers and cleaning crews and office building hotels, there's a higher percentage of Latinas and Black women than white women. We also need to look at the wage gap. This is the best documented consequence of gender segregated work. Regardless of race, men earn more than women of the same racial or ethnic group. The pay gap varies by race and ethnicity. The wage gap also varies by age. The older the worker, the larger the gap. For pay equality to occur between men and women, a broad-based commitment must be made to comparable worth. The belief that wages ought to reflect the worth of the job, not the gender or race of the worker. What we see here on figure 4.3 is the median annual earnings of full-time year-round workers by race and gender. Take a look here for a second. In no field does women make more than men. They typically make less than men. The gap is a little bit smaller among Hispanic, but they are paid significantly less than white or Asian individuals. There's also this notion of the double shift. The double shift occurs where women work a full-time job or multiple part-time jobs and then come home and are responsible full-time for domestic chores and childcare. Figure 4.4 looks at the wage gap between women's earnings as a percentage of men's earnings from 1990 to 2015. They typically make between 40 to 50% of their male counterparts. Let's look at gender discrimination and equalities in treatment. Let's first go back. We had talked shortly ago about sexual harassment, but sexual harassment is important to note. This is a form of intentional, institutionalized gender discrimination that includes all unwelcome sexual attention affecting an employee's job condition or creating a hostile work environment. Most reported cases of sexual harassment involve the harassment of women by men. Some of the individuals most vulnerable to harassment are low-income women, particularly immigrants who may be in the country illegally and fear deportation. Sexual harassment is a costly problem for women who lose employment opportunities, as well as for employers who may lose millions of dollars a year in litigation, low productivity, absenteeism, and employee turnover related to workplace harassment. There's also this notion of the glass ceiling. Though more women have moved up the corporate ladder, many of them have encountered a variety of barriers as they've tried to enter the lucrative and prestigious top positions of their occupations. So what exactly is the glass ceiling? This is the invisible institutional barrier based on attitudinal or organizational bias that prevents qualified and deserving people from advancing upward to top management level positions in their organization, and is often based upon prejudice on the bias of sex, age, political or religious affiliation, weight-based appearance norms, or potentially devalued attributes or characteristics. Overall, women are more likely to reach top positions in the service sector and far worse in male-dominated businesses such as mining, crude oil, brokerages, and manufacturing. Men who enter female-dominated occupations are apt to find little difficulty in rising to the top. This upward movement of men in women's professions, quote unquote, is known as the glass escalator or the glass elevator. And we just saw the picture a few slides ago called the double shift. Although more married women share responsibility for earning part or all of the family income, many men don't participate in routine domestic chores. Consequently, many employed women have a double workload. Again, that's the second shift or the double shift. Not only does the relative number of hours spent on household work differ widely between women and men, but the kinds of chores men and women do also vary significantly. Women do most of the daily chores, such as taking care of the children, making beds, cooking, and cleaning up after meals, while men are more likely to do chores that don't have to be done on a fixed schedule, like yard care, garage work, and household maintenance and repairs. Table 4.1 looks at some of the S&P 500 companies with female CEOs in 2016. Something for us to think about is that there are thousands of companies that are part of the S&P 500, and yet there are only a handful that are listed here that have female CEOs as of 2016. That's a bit of a problem. So what do the different perspectives on gender inequality say? Well, the symbolic interactionist perspective says a little bit. They view society as the sum of all people's interactions, and language is extremely significant in defining social realities because it provides people with shared meanings and social realities. They look at what's called linguistic sexism. These are words and patterns of communication that ignore, devalue, or make sex objects of one sex or another, most often women, and perpetuates traditional gender role stereotypes and reinforces male dominance. For example, male terms like chairman and mankind reinforce the perception of women as secondary. Terms used to devalue women reinforce the notion that they are sex objects. And there's at least 220 terms that exist for sexually promiscuous women, but only 22 terms that exist for promiscuous men. Male dominance is also perpetuated through nonverbal communication, such as body movement, posture, eye contact, use of personal space, and touching. Critics say that this perspective ignores the larger structural factors that perpetuate gender inequality. Now let's shift to the functionalist perspective. Frequently, they examine employment opportunities and the wage gap between men and women. Early functionalists asserted that gender inequality is inevitable because of the biological division of labor. Men found themselves more suited to instrumental or goal-oriented tasks, and women, to expressive or emotionally oriented tasks. This division is supported in what you see in domestic tasks. This division of labor continues in the workplace where women cluster in occupations that require expressive work. Critics note that this explanation does not take into account sex discrimination and other structural barriers that make some educational and occupational opportunities more available to men than to women. Other functionalist explanations of gender inequality focus on the human capital men bring to the workplace. Women often diminish their human capital when they leave the labor force to engage in childbearing and childcare activities. While women are out of the labor force, their human capital deteriorates. When they return to work, women earn lower wages because they have fewer years of work experience, and their education and training may have become obsolete. Critics note that this is based on the false assumption that all people, regardless of gender, race, or other attributes, are evaluated and paid fairly on the basis of their education, training, and other job-enhancing characteristics. Now let's take a look at conflict and feminist perspectives. On gender inequality, conflict and feminist perspectives look at the number of assumptions that social life is the continuous struggle in which members of powerful groups maintain control of scarce resources such as social, economic, and political superiority. Conflict theorists use a Marxist approach and believe that gender inequality primarily results from capitalism and private ownership of the means of production. Under capitalism, men gain control over property and over women and institute and maintain structural forces that are essential to the maintenance of that control. Radical feminists focus exclusively on patriarchy as the primary source of gender inequality. From this perspective, men's oppression of women is deliberate, with ideological justification provided by other institutions such as the media and religion. Liberal feminists believe gender inequality is rooted in gender role socialization that perpetuates women's lack of equal civil rights and educational opportunities. Black feminists believe that women of color face inequalities based on the multitudinal effect of race, class, and gender as simultaneous forces of oppression. So in looking at global gender inequality, and according to the United Nations, approximately 1 out of every 3 women in the world has been beaten, coerced into sex, or otherwise abused in her lifetime, usually by someone she knows. Women remain significantly underrepresented worldwide in governments, political parties, and at the United Nations. Problems of economic opportunity for women are further complicated by high rates of global illiteracy and low levels of educational attainment. Women account for 64% of the nearly 800 million illiterate people worldwide. Women's problems are further exacerbated by poor medical facilities and health crises. AIDS, for example, has taken a devastating toll on the population in regions such as Southern Africa, particularly among girls and women. Another major problem that's part of the health crisis is the high rate of maternal mortality. This is a picture here of women in India who are lining up to open up their own bank accounts, something that they've only recently been able to do. Before, they had to fall in line in patriarchy, and their husband, their father, or their oldest male brother, or the male brother in succession would have to allow her to be able to have access to money. She couldn't be put onto any accounts. So is there a solution to gender-based inequality? Let's look at the different perspectives. Functional conservative solutions to the problem of gender inequality will focus or have a belief that although women and men have different gender roles, this doesn't necessarily mean that gender inequality exists. The primary solution to problems arising from gender differences is to be found in a better educational system and in the strengthening of social institutions. Conflict and liberal solutions are to eliminate all gender-based discrimination as the primary solution for gender inequality. Theorists use the Marxist approach and state that gender equality will come about only when capitalism and patriarchy are abolished. Liberal feminists and liberal political analysts believe that gender inequality can be reduced through legislation that seeks to reduce discrimination and by programs that provide more opportunities to women. Similarly, sexual harassment and violence against women must be actively discouraged, and perpetrators of such offenses must be vigorously prosecuted. Some liberal analysts also highlight the ways in which race, class, gender, and age intersect to produce multiple dimensions of inequality. Finally, symbolic interactionists think that gender inequality can be reduced only when people redefine social realities and eliminate problems such as linguistic sexism. I hope that this was helpful for you. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me via email. Also, make sure that you check the description box below this video for your extra credit question for the week. All you need to do is answer the question by leaving a comment under the video, take a screenshot, and upload it by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. for up to 1 point added to your final grade. As always, I hope you have a great day. Take care, and remember to be kind to yourself and to others.